Welcome again. Are you enjoying the food? Are you enjoying the food? Okay. Are you having a great time? Yes, okay. So I need you to share all that super great energy to support none other than Perrie, coming from Lagos, Nigeria, to talk about how open source and Africa's successes are intertwined. So, thank you, Perrie. The stage is yours.
Hola. Oh, okay, I think I can hear myself now. Hi, everyone. Are we all feeling refreshed? I can see a lot of happy faces. So it's like the food is like good. The DJ is really good, by the way. Like, he plays really, really good music. And it's Afro beats. Perfect. So today we're actually going to be taking a deep dive into Africa as an ecosystem and what we are doing around open source in Africa, how much growth we've actually had over the years, and things that we'll have in stock in the coming years. I'm going to be loading you up with a lot of information, so I hope you've had a lot of food to like digest them with the lunch that you just had. But there's one funny assumption that a lot of people outside of Africa make, and I want to show you this.
You think Africa is a country or a continent?
It's a country. It's a country.
It's a country?
It's a continent.
Make up your damn mind.
Shit, I don't know.
Oh, no, what's your answer, though? I will tell you what the answer is, even if you don't know it.
I feel like it's a country.
You think it's a continent, though? Or do you think it's a country?
Well, I was taught that it was a continent.
Okay.
As a whole, yes, it's a country. But it's one of the continents, I guess is what I'm trying to say, right?
I'm confused. Like, is it country or continent?
It's both, is it not?
So sometime in 2019, I went to France, and I was in Paris. I went to the museum, and so I saw a dude. I was taking pictures, and he's like, "Hey, I can take you pictures." I'm like, "Sure, why not?" And he takes me a picture, and he's like, "Hey, you from Africa?" I'm like, "Yeah." And he's like, "Do you know Patrick?" I'm like, "Patrick? Okay, that's interesting. Patrick is from where?" He's like, "Oh, he's Kenyan." I'm like, "Okay, I'm actually Nigerian, and Kenyan is like really far away from Nigeria, so there's literally no way I would know Patrick." So I think it's one general assumption that a lot of people make and feel like Africa is this really small place that's like a country and everybody knows each other, and we're living in the zoo and have a lot of animals around. But today we're actually going to take a deep dive and talk about how diverse Africa is as a continent and how open source and Africa intertwine. Before we go into that, I think I want to give a brief introduction about myself. My name is Perrie. I do a lot of open source work. I do a lot of design work. I do a lot of community, a lot of programs. And for the most part of the years, I've been very, very involved in the growth of the open source ecosystem in Africa. And I've been doing that through an organization I run with a couple of my friends, Open Source Community Africa. I think some of you must have heard about it. If you haven't, we have our logo right there, so you could just like take a peep. And then I'm also one, if not the only designer that's like currently a GitHub star. And I appreciate GitHub for actually like honoring me with that privilege. So I had this issue with Twitter a couple of months ago. Actually, Oscar's Twitter. If some of you are familiar with the Web3 space and how botted Twitter is when it comes to like Web3. So we did this collaboration with Polygon, and we made a tweet, and then we got bot attacks. And unfortunately, our Twitter account was suspended at that time. And the funny thing about Twitter is, so Samson, who is like a co-founder of Open Source Community Africa, just came to the group and said, "Hey, I think they suspended our Twitter account." And I'm like, how is that possible? And I went to Twitter. My account was good. I logged into Oscar. It was gone. I came back to my account, and it was gone. So I had to start all over again with Twitter. And I was thinking of an interesting name I could use because, I think I have to start growing my connection all over again. And I'm like, I think I should use You Found Perrie because People actually search for Perrie on the internet and can't find Perrie anymore. So here, my new Twitter account, you found Perrie. Now let's take a deep dive into Africa and how diverse this small place or small area that people actually make assumptions is. Africa is a very big continent with over 1.3 billion people. And in Africa, we have over 54 countries in Africa. I am from Nigeria, and I will talk about the diversity that we experience in Nigeria itself. In Nigeria, I think I was talking to Carolina a while ago, and she's like, Portuguese and Spanish are like similar, but then in Spain, they're like different languages, but they are very similar. So you can like understand yourself when like you're having conversations. But myself and Brownie, I don't know if any of us have like noticed, we're like the only two black persons here, so I think we are pretty much very obvious at this point. We come from the southern part of Nigeria, and we can't communicate with our local dialects. That's how diverse it is. We are both from the south, but we speak completely different languages. In Nigeria alone, we have over 300 languages, and the north can basically not freely communicate with the south, except to use our Nigeria local language, the Nigerian pidgin. I don't know if any of you have heard of that, but I think if you followed, for the speakers who came to Oscar Fest, a lot of them were tweeting, Omo, I don't land, I don't do this one. Those are like Nigerian slangs that like everybody in Nigeria can actually like communicate in, and then English. But our local dialects are like really diverse. Imagine how much diversity in language come from the other parts of Africa, the other 53 countries that are not Nigeria. And in this population, we have over 70% of them as less than 30. You see Nigerians Africans at 21, 22, 23, 24, they're done with school, they're done with college, they're looking for jobs, and then they start applying for roles, and you see roles saying, oh, we actually require someone with 10 years of experience. I wonder how someone who's 19 can have 10 years of experience. But that's how our educational system is currently structured. And you have like so much young and vibrant people in Africa. That gives Africa a lot of potential, a lot of leverage over other continents, because we have young ones who are constantly learning, who are constantly growing, who are constantly innovating, and who are constantly building solutions to actually solve local problems. And a lot of them are doing that through open source. Open source as a whole in general has actually empowered the world globally, but it actually has empowered Africa in a way that it helps us in our economic growth. It also helps in innovation, and it greatly, greatly affects digital inclusion. We'll talk about this as we'll continue in our talk. I'm going to talk about some of the challenges that we've noticed in Africa. I'm going to relate it down to the individual level so that we can understand. I think one of them, Brownie, who is here, actually experienced that. I think I'll start with that. So you have a lot of Africans contributing to open source, a lot of Africans building projects, a lot of Africans making connections with people around the world, working remotely for global companies. But one of our major problems that is still a problem today is visa. So while we're coming to Spain, Brownie, who is here, Brownie, sorry, I'm going to be using you, was applying for a visa, and she applied for the visa. Funny enough, they rejected her. Why? Because she didn't have travel experience. Pablo, who is very influential, I'm not sure who Pablo called, they had to call Brownie to bring her passport back to the embassy for her to get her visa. And Brownie is actually one of the many people who have experienced that. For people who are very involved in open source, there's one GitHub star also who is in Nigeria and have been getting rejections for visa over and over and over and over again. And that can be very, very discouraging for like people who are there in Africa and you know that, oh, I'm actually contributing to this project, I'm doing this and this, but I can't even attend open source conferences. I can't go for my company retreats, I can't see my colleagues. I'm literally stuck here in Africa. That's like one challenge that we in Africa actually face. And you see a lot of people now trying to like find ways to actually break that barrier. Another interesting challenge that we face that Open Source Collective has actually helped us solve a lot is the issue of money. Because of how diverse Africa is diverse with population, Africa is diverse with language. It is so diverse with food, so diverse with music. It is actually also so diverse with currency. Nigeria doesn't use the same currency as those in Kenya. So we literally have issues always transferring money. And that is why you've seen a lot of fintech solutions from Africa talking about how they want to solve the issue of transferring money around Africa, which is like one continent. And in the past couple of years, we've literally used Open Source Collective, and Open Source Collective has helped us bridge that gap, but there's still that issue of money and getting more people onboarded in Open Collective. We also have the structural issue of internet and power. I mean, internet at this point and power is getting a lot more accessible, but it's still very expensive and still difficult for people to actually access. For example, for people who work in companies that companies give allowance for internet, you find Nigerians in that company taking a lot more than other employees because they have to spend just a little extra to make sure that they are connected to the internet or to make sure that they have stable connection. There's this joke that I always make on Twitter. You can actually be on your stand-up and then it's black out. And it's like, Nigeria has happened again. So most people go the extra mile to get support for like their power, and that costs a lot of money. So finance is like one other challenge that majority of people in Africa face, especially those who contribute to open source and are basically doing like free open source work. So insensitizing open source work actually helps to encourage people from that part of the world to actually make more contributions to open source. Now we've talked about like the challenges, we've talked about the opportunities that open source presents. Let's talk about the current state of open source in Africa. We've said that we're doing a couple of things advocating for open source. What is actually currently going on in Africa, and where are we currently? I'm going to be discussing 3 different aspects of the growth that we've experienced over the years. I'm going to be talking about projects, I'm going to be talking about startups and companies, and I'm going to be talking about community and contributions. For projects, we actually have like a lot of interesting projects from Africa, from Nigeria. I think some of you are pretty much very familiar with a few. How many of us here how many of us build React apps? How many of us know Chakra UI? So this project was actually built by a Nigerian and currently has literally over 2.1 million downloads. They have almost 10,000 on their Discord. Their GitHub stars is like 19.7. And there are a lot of other projects from Africa, like Downfall.js. Is any of us in flow with data science here? Downfall.js is another really, really amazing project that has come out of Africa and are helping a lot of people make developments. We actually have like a repo on GitHub that AceKid created, made in Nigeria. I think there's also made in Ghana and made in Kenya. And like there are like hundreds and loads of projects that Africans are working on and just like dumping it right there. So in Africa, you have a lot of people who are willing to build, a lot of people who are willing to innovate, a lot of people who are willing to create solutions for other people to build upon and to create open source tools. But we really want the world to see that there's a lot of potential in Africa, and we need the support and we need the attention to be in Africa, because little do you all know that the future of open source is actually in Africa. A statistic that GitHub did in 2019, I don't know if any of you saw this in 2019, but we had like GitHub show the growth that we've had with open source in Africa. Nigeria heading the charts. There is Kenya there, there's Tunisia, there's Morocco. These are all African countries that are creating open source projects on a daily basis. Now, we've talked about projects. There are also like African companies and startups that are building upon open source tools and are creating open source platforms for other people to benefit from. And some of them is highlighted as the startup in Kenya, Lipoba, that developed an energy system that is fully built on an open source tool, and they made this energy accessible to rural areas. And this is actually used by over millions of households in Africa. Another one is the M Farmer, that's like a Ghanaian startup that's also built on open source softwares, and the platform helps people manage pharmacies and inventories. And a lot of people are also using this tool. We also have like other projects like Ushidi. I think Ariel is here. I'm not sure if she's in the hall. She actually worked with them some time ago. They're building like open source platforms there in Africa to help the growth and innovation that's going on there. Now, the huge part of open source over the years, because what we've been doing for the past couple of years has been to grow adoption, has been to increase or reduce that knowledge gap that people have. Before now, we used to have one big challenge, which is knowledge gap, where a lot of people in Africa just feel like, I mean, I think it's general, but majority of people just feel like, oh, it's a developer thing. I'm a designer, I'm a program manager, I'm a product manager, I don't have to get involved in open source. I think for the past couple of years, we've actually been able to gradually close up that gap. And it's funny that in our last Oscar Fest, we actually had a whole lot of people wanting to talk about open source design, and there's been this tremendous growth in open source outside of development and outside of developers. And that brings me to the community that I run with my friends, Open Source Community Africa. At Open Source Community Africa, our goal is basically to increase adoption in Africa and awareness about open source. We do this by hosting events, we do this by onboarding chapter leads, we do this by having the biggest open source festival in Africa. We also do this by supporting people, individuals, and also linking them to open source projects to contribute to. One way, like I've mentioned, is our community aspect of Open Source Community Africa. And the growth that we've actually observed over the years has been very tremendous. We haven't done our 2023 reports, but I'm quite sure that at the end of this year, we'll probably do a 3-4x of what we're currently seeing on the screen. But in 2020, when we launched Oscar around 2018, but we had our first festival in 2020. And after that festival, we had over 1,000 community members. We had Oscar, people in different countries saying, hey, I want to host Oscar Extended. For those who know about Google I/O, you know the Google Extended, and people say giving interest, and we're like, okay, cool. I think we need to start expanding. We started thinking of ways to expand, and we're able to expand to 5 countries. We had 15 different chapters around Africa. And in 2021 statistics is not here because that was COVID, and majority of the things that we did were virtual, online events, and Twitter Spaces. But in 2022, we saw a very high spike in our community numbers. We grew to 3.3 thousand people in the Discord. We moved to 9 countries, and we are currently now in 54 chapters. And then, again, the 2023 report is not out, which I'm very sure it's going to 2x or 3x this number. Other than community and chapters, we also host this event called Open Source Festival that we host every year. If you notice, again, 2021 is not here because of the COVID. But in 2020, when we started the festival, I remember we were just so confused. We're okay, so how do we do this? What city do we do this? Security, how, and then we had our first big open source festival, which was in Lagos. The people who were in attendance that year, it was really overwhelming because, we were expecting 500, but we didn't expect over 100 people. And the hall was so full, to tell you how much we didn't know that people were actually going to attend. The place was hot. It was filled up to the brim. People were outside. And we're okay, I think we need to start thinking of renting a bigger venue and getting more people to the festival. In 2022, we had a spike. It went from 800 to over 1,400 people who attended the festival. And our just concluded Open Source Festival 2023, we have over 2,000 persons who were at the venue each of the days. I think Pablo was there. The hall was actually very full. We literally used one of the biggest event centers in Lagos just to make sure that we accommodate people from different parts of Africa and different parts of the world that we've invited to speak. And one of my favorite moments from Open Source Festival, I was actually going to show an image of my favorite moment from Open Source Festival. is my highlight from the festival. So when Pablo, when Pablo and Andrea came up to Africa, even Jan, they were exploring so much. I literally had to take a picture of this. They had a lot of other local dishes, trying to see the city, and it was really cool having them try Gary flakes. I think even Jan took some home, and he tried out with his partner with milk, which was really interesting. So they actually had a good time. Pablo looks like he's having a good time, but he's like, oh, what is this? And Andrea. But Jan is literally having so much fun trying our local food. Other than community, other than the festival, we've actually also done a lot of collaborations with companies and communities to just empower Africans who are building and who are contributing to open source. And some of those companies and communities are the She Code Africa, which is a community in Africa, but it's very centered around empowering ladies. And we've been able to do a lot of open source women in Africa, where we have a lot of events, a lot of training programs, a lot of hackathons, specifically to empower more women to come into technology, digital inclusion. We've also partnered with Sustain, and since the first Open Source Festival, we've been having Sustain. I don't know, people are familiar with Sustain, right? I mean, we have a podcast at the end of the event today, but we always have Sustain is also an open source event where we come together and talk about the current things that are going on in open source, how to sustain it, the open source ecosystem. And then we've been having Sustain Africa since 2020. We had one in 2021, which was the COVID year. We had another one in 2022, and then finally 2023. We've also done a lot of collaborations with GitHub. They were also giving us funds to host events, to host trainings, to onboard people, and then just share a lot of new awesome things that are going on in GitHub. I mean, shout out to our Oscar sponsors. Every year we have recurring sponsors like Google, like Meta, who are always willing to oh, hey, you need money for the festival? That's it. Open Collective, shout out to all of you. We've also done collaboration with Polygon, who is increasing adoption in Africa in Web3. And we're currently having a hackathon with Atla, currently ongoing right now in Open Source Community Africa. Beyond Open Source Community Africa, there are also other communities in Africa that are growing adoption in open source. And one of them is the Chaos Africa, that started out in June 2022. And now they have over 400 people in their community. They have 5 focus groups, which the most active focus group in Chaos Africa is actually the design. They have over 1,200 people on their socials. Another really interesting community to spotlight is the Open Source Design Africa, which is currently headed by Brownie again. And it started out, I think, sometime last year. They have over 134 designers in the community. They've done over 10 workshops, and they've been able to grow the design community right there in Africa. I can't finish up this talk without mentioning some of the awesome things that open source contributors in Africa are also getting involved in bigger programs like Outreachy. In the December 2022 to March 2023 Outreachy, they had 64 interns, and out of these 64 interns, 55 were African and 25 were Nigerians. So you see how much open source growth is going on in Africa as opposed to other continents. This is also a spotlight to a lot of people who are doing great open source work in Africa. We have Shego, for those of you who know Chakra UI. That's Shego, the person who built Chakra UI. This is Samson Godi, one of the co-founders of Open Source Community Africa. That's Prosper, who has been preaching the gospel of open source since he got into tech. This is SK, the person who built the Made in Nigeria repo. That's Roots, who is currently leading the Chaos Africa, who currently runs program in Open Source Community Africa. I think a lot of programs are coming out in Open Source Community Africa. It's credit to Roots. This is Zara, who is a big open source designer and doing a lot of work in open source. He designed the most famous open source design podcast logo. This is Brownie again, doing a lot of open source work, working with Sustain, working with open source design, working with Superblue and the rest of them. This is Rising from Down4JS. And all these people are doing really, really, really amazing work there in Africa. there's a lot of vibrance, there's a lot of love, there's a lot of interest, there's a lot of yearning for knowledge. There's a lot of people who are wanting to innovate, who are wanting to build solutions, who are wanting to build an open source tool. And for us to be able to thrive and grow adoption in open source in Africa, we actually need a support of a wider community of open source. That's why I'm calling out to people in Europe, in the US, to actually support Africans who are actually coming into open source. If that gap is left, we're actually going to lose a lot of open source persons who are in Africa who would bring a lot of good and sustainability to open source, to proprietary softwares, and that would be a very great loss for the open source ecosystem. When Justin came to Nigeria for the Open Source Festival, he's like, he wants to rephrase, so there was something Samson and Ada had in their keynote, and they're like, the future of open source in Africa. And he's like, the future of open source, yes, is in Africa, but actually, the future of open source is Africa. So the more we empower those in Africa to make more open source contributions, build more open source tools, be more innovative, and build startups and companies, the more we actually grow the open source ecosystem. Thank you very much. Oh, I took a tour in Spain like yesterday, so that's like a picture I took yesterday. Again, find me on Twitter. You found Perrie, our community, oscarafrica.org. You can find us on YouTube and catch up on a lot of open source festivals that I've done over the years. Thank you so much for listening. Gracias, 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 gracias. Questions, I think?
Yeah, so my question is, how can we contribute to open source in Africa?
Okay, there are several ways. One, by supporting projects. Two, by supporting contributors who contribute to open source and insensitizing them to contribute to open source. Like I mentioned, there are a lot of infrastructural problems with people who are contributing to open source, and a little bit of encouragement, a little bit of insensitization would actually encourage more people to do a lot of open source work and do more open source contributions from Africa.
Thank you.
You mentioned outreachy. We've done a few
Outreachy, yes.
We've done a few outreachy projects ourselves. How important is it, would you say, for projects like ours to run outreachy internships for Africans being involved in open source?
I think it's actually very important because a lot of people get onboarded in open source by actually getting involved with this program. Some of them get into Google Summer of Code, outreachy, and the rest of them. So it's a way of paying them while doing open source work and them actually feeling like, oh, I'm doing open source work and it's actually not for free, I'm getting paid for the internship. And it's very encouraging and very relaxing for people in Africa to actually get involved in those programs and get paid while doing open source work. Because one narrative is, it's open source, I don't get anything from it. So if they get involved in programs like this, it's very encouraging to tell them that you can actually do open source and also get paid while doing open source.
Thank you.
I have a question from YouTube, from Andre. What do you value the most from Penpot, and what is the most beneficial thing for you?
For me, I think when Pablo reached out to me, I think it was in 2019, it was basically like, oh, there's actually an open source design tool. I mean, there was Inkscape and the rest of them, but there was one that was actually very familiar to those who are always using Figma. So having Penpots in the design space and getting, the value is actually enormous to think of because you have a lot of designers who complain about using Inkscape and the rest of them who does not have graphic design actually feel that smooth onboarding into open source, and now they can use Penpot, which is very familiar to Figma that they use. So they actually don't have any excuse, I would say, to contribute to open source. So yes, that is actually very empowering for designers who have always shied away. I think that's one thing that we also notice very well in Africa, who are shied away from using tools like Inkscape and the rest of them.
Thank you. I have a second question, which is, when people that I teach in the US, when I teach them about programming tools and open source, one of the barriers that I face is people are, they want to learn proprietary tools because proprietary tools give them a sense that they are learning the professional sort of middle class grade software tools. And so when I come and I try and teach them open source tools, they feel sort of like they're not getting the best tools, they're just getting like the free stuff. Do you find the same or similar things happening in Africa where people want proprietary tools because they feel like those are the proper ones?
I would say in Africa, one notion that a lot of people get drawn to open source is before the whole knowledge gap was closed, you get a lot of people talking about, oh, I'm doing open source work and it's for free. I'm actually contributing to open source, but what do I benefit from contributing to open source? So that has been like the conversation around like open source in Africa. And the more we actually like grow this adoption, the more we tell people that there are a lot of benefits to get from open source. I think one very specific benefit that a lot of people are jumping on now is that you can actually build your career experience contributing to open source, and that is one that actually caught a lot of attention from like folks in Africa and actually getting them to like do more open source contributions and pay attention to more open source softwares and tools.
Yeah, I have one more question. I was born in Mozambique, and it's a Portuguese-speaking country. And so there's some barriers in Africa, of course, like if you talk about being rich or poor in Africa, there's a lot of poorness. So how do you see the barriers for countries? Like I see like the open source is becoming big in Africa, but it's more like English-speaking countries because maybe it's easier to find documentation, tutorials, and a lot of kids, let's say in Mozambique, they don't know how to speak, for example, English. So there's this big barrier. How do you think we can improve that? And maybe just giving some ideas, can maybe create more documentation in other languages, or how can we try to solve this issue in non-English speaking countries?
Yeah, so this question reminds me of a project Samson worked on in Sugar Labs where he had to translate the whole documentation to like local languages in Africa. And that's like one way to actually break that barrier. Some of the projects there in the Made in Nigeria, that's one that actually like helps in like other local languages, making it accessible for people who do not really understand English to actually like get in sync with the open source space and actually make more contributions and use more open source tools. So having things like that, having people translate this documentations and the rest of them into local languages would actually help bridge that gap. And this is why we need more people to get involved in like building the ecosystem in Africa and getting them engaged with this type of activities to grow adoption.
Can you? Okay. So you have mentioned that in order to get all the movement of the open source Africa, so you have been focused also in Web3, in the Web3 space and so on. So what kind of dynamics inside of the Web3 space you are using to try to increase the power of the community, like, I don't know, streams to the contributors or quadratic funding or this kind of dynamics?
Okay, so Web3 is actually one of the things that we've done. It's not like our primary focus. What we did is collaboration with Polygon, where they had like a 1-month training program where they like trained people on like Solidity and the rest of the Web3 languages. We're currently doing one hackathon. I think there's a price tag for whoever comes up with a very interesting solution. And those are like ways that we'll actually collaborate with like Web3 organizations. We've done just 2 Polygon, and Alexa.
So now it's more like focused to try to educate the people in the Web3 space in order to get the skills there.
Yes.
Okay.
So in Africa, one thing you would find very, very well is people are willing to learn. People are curious. People are trying to look for ways to actually innovate. So bringing that knowledge to them, it's like making it very accessible to them and getting them to do more cool stuff with the knowledge that they have.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Gracias.